You know, my revenge will be success. And I mean that. But it's awfully hard when you see what they've done. These people are so evil. And at the same time, the country can come together. You know, I'm saying this, but the country can come together.
You famously said regarding Hillary Clinton, lock her up. You declined to do that as president.
I beat her. It's easier when you win. And they all said lock her up. And I felt, and I could have done it, but I felt it would have been a terrible thing. And then this happened to me. And so I may feel differently about it. I can't tell you. I'm not sure I can answer the question. Hillary Clinton, I didn't say lock her up, but the people would all say lock her up, lock her up. Okay. Then we won. And I said pretty openly, I say, all right, come on, just relax. Let's go. We're going to make our country great.
Every time I mention her, everyone screams, lock her up, lock her up, lock her up. They keep screaming. And you know what I do? I've been nice. But after watching that performance last night, such lies, I don't have to be so nice anymore. I used to say just a couple of weeks ago, let's just beat her on November 8th. But you know what? You have a point. Crooked Hillary Clinton. Oh, she's crooked, folks. She's crooked as a $3 bill. Okay, here's one. Just came out. Lock her up is right. Tell you what, for what she's done, they should lock her up. She's disgraceful. It's disgraceful. So crooked Hillary, crooked, you should lock her up, I'll tell you. Lock up the Bidens. Lock up Hillary. Lock them up.
That final one was just a few weeks before the 2020 election when he was calling for the imprisonment of his political opponent.
So I guess he agrees with...
by his attorney general. And he kept saying, despite the lies to the Fox and Friends weekend crew, which, of course, they didn't challenge him after he said that, he said, lock her up repeatedly, joined in, agreed with the crowd repeatedly. The guy completely... And this idea, Jonathan Lemire, that he didn't push after he was president of the United States to investigate Hillary, he did time and again. And time and again, his attorney generals came back and said, there's nothing to indict her on.
Yeah, I was struck by how many of those rallies, both in 2016 and 2020, I attended. And this was one of the signature pieces of his act, was the lock her up chants from the crowd that he would egg on and eventually would say he agreed with. And as president, we're no longer a candidate, as president, with the power of the government behind him, he absolutely asked Attorney General Jeff Sessions and later Bill Barr if there were means to prosecute the Clintons, and the answer was no. And then, as you just mentioned, there in the fall of 2020, we could see the polls and see that he was losing to Joe Biden. He pushed Bill Barr to investigate the Bidens as well. That, of course, did not come to pass, but there was one of the reasons why
Well, and he said lock him up. He said the Bidens should be locked up. And he said that 2 weeks before the election. I mean, you talk about something straight out of Russia. There's a reason he admires Putin. There's a reason he admires Orban. There's a reason he's in love with Kim Jong-un. He and President Xi, why he says President Xi is so brilliant, he loves that they have the power of authoritarians, and that's what he wants, and that's what he's promising his voters they'll get if they vote for him.
Yeah, in that same interview over the weekend, he said that they would go after, if he were to win again, his Department of Justice would go after his political foes. He thinks that would be fair play because of this case in Manhattan, which, of course, we know Joe Biden, President Biden, had nothing to do with. And if there's any better evidence of President Biden not being involved with the intricacies of the DOJ, it's that his son, Hunter Biden, his beloved son, Hunter Biden, his own trial starts in just a few hours in Delaware.
So joining the conversation, we have the president of the National Action Network and host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, Reverend Al Sharpton, and NBC News and MSNBC political analyst, former U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill. She and Jen Palmieri, co-hosts of the MSNBC podcast, How to Win 2024. Good to have you.
So Senator Claire McCaskill.
Former prosecutor.
Talk about Donald Trump, his lies over the weekend, saying he never called for Hillary Clinton to be locked up, and how the guy who actually promoted the politicalization of the Justice Department the most is the one now lying, claiming that it was Joe Biden who started this investigation in 2018 before he was even the Democratic nominee, and was somehow responsible for a New York grand jury and a New York jury of 12 finding Donald Trump unanimously guilty on 34 counts of felonies.
Yeah, what's interesting about this is that the Republicans who are denigrating the institutions that make sure we have a rule of law in this country that applies to everyone, these folks are advocating for red state DAs to go out and prosecute Democrats. And Donald Trump, when he got in the White House, wanted the Justice Department to bend to his will and go after his political opponents. What they forget is the most essential ingredient in our rule of law is evidence. And evidence is not a Democrat. Evidence is not a Republican. Evidence is not a communist or a libertarian or a socialist. Evidence is what comes into court for juries to consider. And the reason that Donald Trump is being prosecuted is not complicated. It's because of the evidence. And I thought this interview was astounding in so many ways. How about him firing all the generals and putting in MAGA loyalists? Can you imagine what that would do to our military? Can you imagine the upheaval that would cause within a military that is so important right now with the world in the kind of, on knife's edge in terms of the Middle East and in terms of what Russia's trying to do, China's desire in terms of what they want to do with their power in that part of the world. So I listen. And when the mask slipped, Joe, when he said, "It's easier when you win," that phrase was really interesting to me because it for a moment there, he was acknowledging that he ran once and didn't win.
Yeah. Rev, the thing that, of course, his voters should know about Donald Trump, but they won't. But the thing that everybody else needs to understand, those swing voters who are going to decide who is the next president of the United States, is this is a guy that does not respect American democracy unless elections turn out in his favor. And he doesn't respect the rule of law, which actually I think is the bedrock of our constitutional republic. He doesn't respect the rule of law unless it gets to the outcome that serves him the best. And this weekend on Politics Nation, you actually interviewed someone who can tell that story as well as anybody, and it is very personal to him because Donald Trump was calling for this man's execution even after we all knew he was innocent.
Donald Trump, who never took a public position on any race case in New York, and I'm talking about killings in Howard Beach, killings in Bensonhurst. I mean, people killed because of the color of their skin. But when 5 young black and brown young men, teenagers, were arrested and charged with raping and beating a white woman in Central Park, and some of us stood up and said, wait a minute, these people's families are saying they didn't do it, they weren't there, it doesn't make sense. They were convicted. Donald Trump, who never took a position on anything else, took out full-page ads, actually spent money. He's notorious for not paying bills, spent money in 5 newspapers and called for them to be given the death penalty. And after DNA evidence proved that none of the 5 were there, he still refused to back down. And so one of the 5, who's now a member of the city council, came on my show this weekend because as we see these polls talking about black men moving away from Trump. They need to know what they're moving toward. Here's a man who committed himself to the execution of young black men, even when the evidence was the other way. Here's a man that was, many of us are adversaries of the stop and frisk policy. Nobody was closer to Rudy Giuliani and stop and frisk than Donald Trump. So young black men are looking at someone who has never regarded the letter of law for anybody, not just blacks, but specifically for blacks when he raised it. But he had no respect for law at all. When you have a man that now talks about judges and others like there's something wrong with them if they judge him, it is a threat to all of us. And I think that we need to understand this election is more than a race between two older men. This is about where we're going to have law in this country.
Well, and he doesn't respect the judges. He doesn't respect the rule of law. He doesn't respect American democracy unless he wins. When he loses, he undermines it. He attacks America. He says America's horrible. But also, let's talk about the jury.
Yeah.
Him going after the jury, even when his lawyer said the jury did a very good job. But think about the sacrifice those jurors made for 6 weeks away from work, away from home, away from their families, away from their lives, under incredible stress. Now being doxxed. Now Trump people trying to dox them, trying to find out who they are, to terrorize them, the threats. These people sacrificed an awful lot.
Yeah.
And for Marco Rubio to
feed into that,
to feed into the hatred, to feed into the threats by saying that this is like Castro's
disgraceful.
Cuba. For other Republicans to feed into that by suggesting that these American citizens who did their civic duty, who went and sat for 6 weeks, that somehow they're in line with Joseph Stalin and just the heinous show trials of the 1930s in the Soviet Union. It's unspeakable. And make no mistake, these Republicans that attack the jurors, that attack the decision, that attack the judicial system, and make those comparisons with the worst dictators of the 20th century, all they're doing is they're putting the lives of the judge, the family, the jurors, everybody in danger.
Yeah.